Patricia Clavin, we'll be thinking about the nature of the relationship between Britain and the European continent in your company this evening during the interwar period, the period between the two great world wars. What, for you, is the year or the event that somehow best sums up the nature of the relationship between Britain and Europe?
I would like to link a year with an event. So for me, the year that best sums it up is 1933, which is, of course, an eventful year on many levels. But the event I would then hone in on is the World Economic Conference of 1933, which was a conference organised by the League of Nations and hosted here in London at the World Geological Museum. And it brought together all of the world's leading powers, so European powers, also the United States, China, and so on. And its prime focus was to facilitate multilateral cooperation to combat the Great Depression. And it was a linked event to the League of Nations Disarmament Conference that was meeting at the same time. So it was an attempt to think about economic and financial issues in relation to hard security issues. And the reason for me that that event is so iconic is that it marks a moment when the European powers look to Britain for leadership. It actually is the pinnacle of about 13 years of diplomacy by the British in Europe and globally to promote multilateral trade negotiations, to try and open up trade, which had become stifled in the wake of the First World War, to get rid of trade barriers, and also to promote currency coordination and cooperation. Britain had provided a lot of the financial underpinnings for the reconstruction of the European economy after the First World War. But in the wake of the Great Depression, and also because of tensions in some respects at home and the failure of Britain really to deal with some domestic issues and the challenges internationally, by 1933, Britain had also begun to turn away from that type of internationalism, turned away from the League, turned away from Europe, and was moving into its empire. And so 1933 captures that moment when Britain is inside Europe, but it's also beginning to turn away from it. But the expectation of the world is still that Britain will provide leadership. At that point, nobody's really looking to the United States. We now tell that history, expecting the Americans to be involved. And of course, the other reason that 1933 and the World Economic Conference is so important is it's the first conference to which the Nazi government sends delegates. And so it's a moment where the Nazis actually at this point are not very noisy. They're taking in the scene and they learn that the British now don't want to be terribly involved. And even better from their perspective, the British are not really interested any longer in cooperating, particularly with the French. And actually they really alienate the new American president, Franklin Roosevelt, it's also his first big international conference. So it's a tipping point moment. And many of the issues that surface for the first time in that conference then come back in 1939. I mean, they're there in the 30s and then have to be resolved again with a new international order after 1945.
And when we hop, as it were, onto the mainland, the European continent, and when we look at the British Isles from the European continent, and when we think about the leaders of opinion, the formers of opinion in the European mainland, how did they conceive of Britain and the British Isles? Did they, for example, think of it as being necessarily European?
Well, it's important to remember that Europe conceives of itself in a way as a global order at this point. So it's not the global order that we get to know after 1945 in the Cold War, which has the United States and the Soviet Union as the access points, or the kind of multipolar world that we have after 1990. Most European statesmen and opinion leaders think of Britain as part of Europe, certainly as part of the geopolitical order of Europe, but they also recognise that Britain is a global power. It's an imperial power, but that's also true of European states too. So it's true of the Netherlands, it's true of Belgium, it's true of France, it's true of Spain, it's true of Portugal, and so on. So the idea that in British minds sometimes that they have to choose between empire and Europe, in European minds, there is no choice. The two things actually are part of the same. It is true that a nation like France has a greater sense of itself being a land-based empire, whereas Britain is more of an outward-looking empire. But that's, makes it much more like the Dutch. And in many ways, the Dutch and the British are very important European partners. So certainly from the European context, Britain is seen to be European. And one of the most straightforward ways for me in my own research to have seen that is inside the work of the League of Nations, which produces actually enormous amounts of data. And it forms the basis of the way that we think about the world in the first half of the 20th century, that's then picked up by the UN and other think tanks after 1945. And in their classification, Britain is always part of the European continent. The Soviet Union, Russia, is not. Britain is. But it's ironically a classification that's drawn up in part by Britons themselves.